what I can do.
I thought I unmuted it. Testing, testing. 1, 2. Want me good, Jeff? You project well enough to not use it though. Yeah. All right. Is it a battery? Oh.
There you go. Okay, we got you.
No. There I am. Thanks, love. Cool. Hi. Okay, I was gonna introduce myself all formally and do all of that, and everybody in here calls me Charli, so I guess I'll introduce myself that way. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming and being here. We're gonna start with an activity. So get up, please. Okay, so I want you to take your right hand and touch something to your right and give it all of your attention.
Can it be us?
Yes, it can be another person, it can be a chair. It doesn't have to be breathing. It can just be. I want you to give it all of your attention. And by the way, this is bad. So now, I want you to take your left foot and place that somewhere intentionally. Give it all of your attention. This is also bad. I want you to engage in eye contact somebody who is not right next to you. Give it all of your attention. This is also bad. Finally, I want you to speak to someone who's at least 3 people away from you. Give it all of your attention. This is bad. So this is also bad. For teenage girls, thank you. You can all have a seat.
Is that the good one, Charli?
So for teenage girls, for black teenage girls, they've been asked to do the same thing. Their attention is divided, their identity is divided, and it's always pathologized. No one aspect of them is looked at unless it is a bad thing, but it's only one thing. It doesn't speak to the multiplicity of what any people are. So my heart and my passion go with black teenage girls. Many girls today are faced with stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is essentially, of course, my note card fell. But they're numbers, so that's good. Stereotype threat is when other people have negative perceptions of you and you internalize them. This permeates our society. We can see it everywhere. For women, it comes up with things like math ability. Most women are perceived to be worse at math than their male counterparts, women and girls actually, as well as things like non-white, non-males are seen as being less intelligent or just less than in a lot of different ways. So this is stereotype threat. When that gets internalized by the people who are being perceived in that way, it becomes a larger issue, particularly that of identity. So my question was, how do we take these teenage girls from being fragmented particles to being whole selves? Black girls are often faced with double, maybe triple identity kind of crises, where they're being judged negatively because they're black, which is something they can't actually help. They're being judged negatively because of their femaleness, also something, well, they can help that these days, but that's a lot of work to actually change one's sex. Gender is a little bit easier to social construct. And often, people of color are disproportionately poor. So many black women, many black teenage girls have 3 threats that are working against them constantly, every day, day in, day out, that they can't necessarily do too much about. Things are outside their control as far as changing those things. Socioeconomic status can be changed, but many black girls don't know that can be changed. So it kind of goes in a lot of different directions. We need positive cultural models to help mitigate all of this constant onslaught of negativity coming toward our girls. So for black people, I use black as opposed to African American because there are a lot of black people, particularly in the United States, who are not from America and are therefore not American. So to kind of speak to the diversity within black populations, I use the term black versus African American. So there are many different notions of identity currently being thrown around in research. Clark and Clark way back in the 40s, in the 1940s, as early as 1939, these two people did identity research on preschool, very young children, very young black children, and they gave them, in some instances it was a doll, in some instances it was a drawing, and they said, show me the one that's like you. An alarming amount of children, now children are at a different developmental stage and that certainly has to be taken into account, but an alarming amount of them chose the picture of the white drawing. And in this case it was a white male drawing. For the girls, they were asked, who's like your brother, who looks like your brother or your friend or your cousin, something like that. So they could do that, which is obviously 60 years later, or 73 years later, that's changed too. Also, Parham, White, and Ajamu, they said that identity for black people provides a social anchor and a meaning. It gives them existence. It gives them kind of substance to their existence for black people. The queer community also talks about identity, and some of the literature coming out of the queer community talks about how there are so many different intersectionalities within one's identity that trying to parse them out then becomes gives a false sense of dichotomy and becomes alienating for many of the people for whom that's asked of. The experiences of black women are clearly intersectional and cannot be adequately explained with an isolated emphasis on either race or gender. And that's true of all of us, isn't it? If you think about all of the things, all of the hats you wear, all the different ways you might identify yourself, try dividing them. So that activity we did at the beginning is similar to how black girls in particular are treated in the literature. Very pulled apart, parsed out. Because of that, they're often viewed through the lens of delinquency or otherwise negative images, including stereotypes that are perpetuated in a lot of the literature because only one thing is being studied, and that one thing is often bad. That one thing is a pathologizing effect of research, I would say. And so finding new models to give black girls a different way to view themselves rather than these very fragmented pieces that are all pathological. In essence, then, mainstream psychology is off the mark. It's missing its mark as far as addressing the needs of, this talks about black people in general, but particularly black girls who have then their femaleness also against them in kind of the view of society and in particular mainstream psychology. So what can we do? What are the ways that we can help to mitigate black girls being divided in the ways that they are? Well, we not only have to create a new picture, we have to create a new frame to hold that picture. Shorter Gooden and Washington, they have started this research and they talk about, they've explored the notions of young black women and what they actually feel, these young black women, in their own lived experience. Some of the things that came out were identity is related to being black, identity is related to being female, strength, either their own strength which has gotten them through adversity or their perceived strength of other mostly black women who've gotten those black women through their diversity, and relationships, being in community with others are some of the things that came out of this particular study. There are also many promising inroads being made with other groups. In particular, there's more up there, but in particular, women and their math abilities, also young black males, teenage boys, teenage black boys, and positive, culturally centered. By culturally centered, I mean ma'at, which is an ancient Egyptian principle. Culturally sensitive and culturally centered meditation techniques. And they've done studies with middle school students where they had them write, middle school students of color, and had them write affirmations throughout the course of a school year, and noticed it made a really significant difference. There are others, as you can see as well. I also think that transpersonal psychology is a fantastic container to hold this multiplicity of being. Transpersonal psychology focuses on a number of things, but the pieces in particular I'm focused on are its holistic nature and its transformative nature. I think that transpersonal psychology is really the thing that can hold this and grow and nurture black girls' identity, anybody's identity. My focus is still black women and black girls. But to hold this identity and to create this new frame, and not just create the new picture, but to really reweave the notion of what identity is. Finally, in integration toward wholeness, some things that we can do as people, we can do as adults, we can do as researchers, we can do as models. Expand the definition of what identity means so that it's more inclusive of the multiplicity and the many different layers and levels that people have. Also, to emphasize wholeness and emphasize how wholeness is important. You would be amazed at what children are, they see everything. They see everything that you do. And we as women, often are nitpicking ourselves and saying and reinforcing the message that we're not enough. And so by changing that, by saying, you know what, I'm pretty awesome, and saying that aloud intentionally when girls are present, and men, I encourage you to do the same for both girls as well as boys. But saying out loud that, yes, it's important that I'm whole and I am whole will go a long way. We need to work on all generations, but I would say start young. Letting girls know that they're enough, but also creating community for these young women as they go through their crazy journeys. Adolescence is a really rough time these days. Probably by and large, maybe crazier even than when we were going through adolescence here in this room. Mentoring, being that light for a young person somewhere, particularly a young black girl, and research. Because there's not a whole lot of research that doesn't pathologize black teenage girls, we have to create it. And I think that, again, transpersonal as a lens, being here with that as a focus, will make a lot greater inroads than what has already been made. But we have to do the work, and we have to be willing to do that work. So that concludes this part of my presentation, and I'll open it up for questions. Christine?
What will your research be?
My research is, wants to go in 3 different directions. So looking at kind of what I've looked at here, the fragmentation of teenage girls and creating a model of wholeness. So that's a lot for a dissertation. I will pick one piece of that, and because June of 2015, I am out of here. So I have a deadline, and I intend to stick to my deadline. And right now, I'm on track. So, so looking at kind of the sense of fragmentation and how that shows up for, or not fragmentation or wholeness. There are some girls who feel like they're whole, but that number's pretty low from my experience.
So are you coming from an assumption on fragmentation, or are you
I hear that that's not, so dissertation was the second one, to find it and then create the method, the assessment method. That is kind of what I want to do. So even though I keep hearing that kind of mixed method study is maybe prolonging time here to actually get that, to do that thoroughly. That is what I would like to do. Both is the broader vision for the dissertation. I haven't quite decided on which piece of that I'm going to focus on. Jude?
Are you gonna, concentrate on one aspect of transpersonal experience in your?
For my dissertation, yes, one is better than 5.
Well, like with dreams, or you don't know?
Probably not dreams, probably closer to lived experience. With my work with girls, with teenage girls of a variety of backgrounds, they just don't, they feel, they're so low. They don't feel, by and large, even those who have a pretty good self-image and self-esteem level, they still don't feel good enough. So what does that look like specifically for Black girls is kind of my focus at the moment. Heather?
Are you considering focusing on one particular site and one particular group of teenage girls, say over a period of 2 years, and kind of using that as a model, or are you looking? So are you looking at using participants, or is it more research based?
For my dissertation, it won't be 2 years, but yes, it will be less than 2 years. It will be over time for that. For my dissertation, yes, we'll probably one group in one location because that's dissertationable. And that's that tiny slice of the pie that will get me out of here in June of 2015, which is still my plan. Mandisa?
Yes, so how would you apply your research if you encountered a Black girl or woman who was Black by ancestry, but wasn't wanting to define as African American, African, or anything at all? Like, I'm just a child of the universe. I'm not interested in identity, gender, or nailing anything down. How does your research deal with that?
I'm not sure I've explored that topic yet, but for like what comes to mind for me, what comes to mind and heart for me is that that's what I'm exploring is kind of how my assumption of Blackness, how that is lived by other people, by other women, and that includes the multiplicity of I don't identify as Black or I don't identify as female. I think that's part of the spectrum. That's part of the scope. I'm not sure what I would do with it in a research context, and unless I was studying sort of that idea specifically, my guess, my hunch, is that that might be an outlier in the research, and then kind of, so it gets included in research analysis, but there's also kind of like, and there was one participant, or maybe there's a colony, maybe it's a lot of participants, but that this particular ideation of who someone is or is not is part of the multitudinous lens. Any other questions? Yes. Hi, Melissa.
Are you currently working with a group of Black girls?
I'm actually currently working with Latino youth right this moment as far as working with girls. But I have worked with kind of, I'm scoping that out for dissertation stuff in particular. But so not precisely at this moment in an organized way.
Do you have groups that you're interested in aligning with?
Yes, yes, and I'm in contact with some of those connections and still building some of them as well. So I'm definitely open to more connections in that regard. Yes. Hi.
I'm kind of curious, because it was on my mind. Is there, have you, in working with maybe Latino girls and with Black girls, do they respond differently to questions or to you or other people when they're in different places, whether it's the school or in a city park, or a forested area, or, is it situational? I mean, not.
Yes, usually, and I would say that's with all girls. The overwhelming majority of girls that I've worked with thus far, I'll get different answers depending on who's around, and also depending on their age. So with the group that I work with at the moment, there's there's two distinct triads. And so one person, one girl in any of those triads by herself will give me a different answer than even with two parts of the triad or all three parts of the triad in that one location on that same day within 15 minutes of asking the same question. So it's almost always situational, but even with the situational, you can find, I found underlying themes. I found underlying themes of not wholeness, of not enoughness, and of feeling like everything has to be a certain way, and that way is maybe not the way these girls are naturally. So yes, everything is situational, and finding those underlying themes to kind of weave it all together.